Hey guys, Sarah here. I love that you're watching this, especially on a week when we're not gathering in person. I don't know about you, but I have been loving that even though we don't all get to be in the same room together at youth, that we're still all tracking through the story together. See, as it pieces together all the different stories in the Bible, it helps me understand how they all fit together and how my story fits within God's story. Well, this week we get to cover one of my favorite stories in Scripture. But first, this is already week 5 of the story, and I think it's time we do a little recap. So, if you have your copy of the story at home, pause this, go grab it, and maybe grab some paper and a pen and come back. Like, actually do it right now. Okay, if you don't have a copy of the story yet, make sure you let your small group leaders know because we want to make sure you get one. Okay, so far, we've covered creation, Adam and Eve, and the story of Noah and the ark. And all the way through, we started to discover how God has been at work in the world and in our stories since the very beginning. And we learned about Abraham and Sarah, this older couple who miraculously had a baby named Isaac. Even when they were 90 and 100 years old, it's crazy. And Isaac, he went on to have 2 sons named Jacob and Esau. And last week, Bex unpacked their story and we discovered the power of reconciliation, making things right again in our relationship with God and with others. Okay, that's a lot for 2 chapters. But this week, we get to jump in to chapter 3. So you can turn there right now. Now, since you're probably watching this on your own today, or maybe with a friend or brother or sister, we're going to try something a little bit different. And as we go, I want you to grab a notebook or a piece of paper and draw it out as we work through it. Now, don't worry if you're not a great artist. I'm a stick person level artist all the way, so you're in good company. So one of the 2 brothers that we learned about last week, Jacob, he had 12 sons. 12 of them. And one of Jacob's sons was without a doubt his favorite. And it was obvious to everyone else. His name was Joseph, and he was the second youngest of the whole bunch. Now, what's the coolest piece of clothing that your mom or your dad or someone else could give to you? Maybe think ahead to Christmas. Is there a pair of shoes or a jacket or a snowboard? I don't know if a snowboard counts as a piece of clothing, but it attaches to your feet, so I feel like it does. But what would that be? Now, imagine that your mom or your dad buys that for your brother or your sister, but not you. How would that feel? Well, that's exactly what Jacob did because Joseph was his absolute favorite. He gave him this really fancy, colorful robe, but only to Joseph. How do you think his brothers felt about that? Yep, jealous. Actually, they hated Joseph for it. So I have my little Joseph. I did some pre-drawing because I'm not even confident in my stick figures. But on his little jacket here, I'm going to make it all the different colors because it's super fancy. You could do like a fancy leather jacket. You could do a fancy snowboarding jacket. I don't know why I'm on a snowboarding kick, but you could do that too. Throw some blue in here. Man, I haven't used markers in a really long time. This is fun. All right. I've got his nice little colorful jacket. Okay, another question. And you can keep coloring or drawing if you're doing that. Do any of you guys have super weird dreams? I do. Sometimes I wake up in the morning and I try to explain them to my husband, Andrew, and they literally make no sense. But somehow when I was dreaming, they did, and it all connected. They're like this combination of an action movie and a video game mixed with like parts of my life or my brain. I don't really know. Do you have those? Well, what we'll discover is that Joseph also had dreams, but his were often legit and they meant something. And one day, when Joseph is a teenager, he has this dream that all of his brothers were bowing down to him. And he felt the need to head on over and tell them all about it. How do you think that went over? Yep, just like that. But seriously, in those days, it communicated clearly to Joseph's brothers that their father loved him most, that he'd given them this coat, and that had caused jealousy and bitterness to rise up. And then when he tells them about this dream, it says in Genesis chapter 37, when he told his brothers, they hated him even more than ever. So that was not like the best move on his part. So as we look at these three scenes of Joseph's life today, we're actually going to only get through part of his story because there's so much going on. But at the beginning of chapter 3, so hopefully throw something in there so you can turn quickly. Jacob, Joseph's father, he sends him to go check on his brothers who are hanging out with their flocks far away. And he goes, hey, go check on your brothers, make sure they're all good. And so somewhere near your Joseph and your jacket, I want you to draw just like some sheep and some fields and then 11 brothers. And it'll be much speedier if you do it with stick people. All right, so I've got my sheep. They don't have heads. I don't know why. I've got 11 brothers. 1, 2, 3. Yep, they're all good. Some of them are missing limbs, but they're great. All right, so page 29, and it says this. All right. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. So his brothers are obviously not super pumped to see Joseph show up, and they make this plan to kill him. But one brother, Reuben, he steps in and suggests that they throw him in a cistern instead of killing him outright. And a cistern is basically like a big well or a container in the ground that typically held water. And so he'd die in there eventually. But Reuben, see, he wasn't brave enough to stand up to all his brothers, but he was actually trying to stall to save Joseph and then go back and rescue him after. So points for effort, sort of. But when Joseph shows up, they steal his robe and they throw him in the cistern to die, and then they sit down for lunch. And you think that you don't always get along with your siblings. But as they're eating, a caravan goes by, or this long train of merchants, and the brothers, they decide to sell Joseph to them as a slave. It still gets rid of him, and they make some cash. Win-win. But as they head home, they need to explain where Joseph is because their dad sent him to check on him. And so they take his coat and they dip it in animal's blood. And his dad, Jacob, thinks that he's been killed by a wild animal. That's a lot that just happened. So again, take a second and draw it out. I've got my camel. I've got a cistern. We'll color our camel. We'll write they're going to Egypt because they're on their way. That's Jacob up here. He's very sad because he thinks his son is dead. And he's got the bloody coat to prove it. Color in our little camel. So nice. And our sign. And we'll throw some color on our jacket. How about that? Man, I'm glad I pre-drew some of this. And if you guys are drawing right now, I'm impressed if you're keeping up. All right, so we've got Jacob, who thinks his son died. We've got all the brothers who've just concocted this plan and they're going with it. Reuben clearly doesn't speak up and tell his dad that his brother's alive. And we've got Joseph being sold as a slave and heading to Egypt. Whew. All right, grab your story and turn back to page 31. Okay, awesome. It says, meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt. So those are the people who bought him as a slave. They sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. Now, Pharaoh is like the head honcho of all of Egypt, like the king. And Joseph was sold to Pharaoh's captain of the guard named Potiphar. Okay? So already things are not going well for Joseph. He's sold into slavery by his brothers. He ends up in a completely foreign city, and he's sold to the captain of the Pharaoh's guard. And he lost his super fancy coat. But check out what happens next. The top there of page 31, it says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the merchants who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of the Egyptian master. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. And so Potiphar put him in charge of everything in his household and entrusted to his care everything he owned. Don't miss that phrase. The Lord was with Joseph. And then just a little bit later, when his master saw that the Lord was with him. Those are two things that we're going to see come up over and over. And so I would encourage you, take whatever you're using to draw or a highlighter or a pen and circle or highlight those phrases every time you see them. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him, then he entrusted him with everything. Now, we don't get all of the details, but I love imagining just how that unfolded. There must have been something about Joseph's relationship with Potiphar that opened his master's eyes to the God that he served. This wasn't just Potiphar thinking, Joseph's a cool guy. It was Potiphar discovering that Joseph was trustworthy because God was with him. How about your friends at school? If you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, do people know that? Do they think, yeah, he's cool or she's really nice? Or do they connect the dots and realize that you are the way you are because of Jesus? Maybe this week, take some time to think about that one when you're hanging out with God. Throughout Joseph's story, we'll be reminded of those two things over and over. The Lord was with him, and others were watching and noticing. So if you're drawing his story out, it might look something like this, but probably a little bit more fancy. It got rough there for a while, but things are starting to look up because Joseph's arrived in Egypt as a slave, and now he's been entrusted and put in charge of Potiphar's whole household. Now, that's a big deal. So I'm just going to jot down, okay, they're in Egypt. And this is Potiphar's nice house with the fancy windows. And then Potiphar and Joseph, they're smiling because they're friends. And that's great. So now this crazy thing happens and his story takes a turn again. It's really like a roller coaster. So back to your story and bottom of page 31. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while, the master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Well, this whole scenario plays out where she keeps trying to get him to sleep with her, and he says no every time, and he never gives in, and he makes it really clear to her that that is not an option. But one day, when no one else is around, she tries again. And even though Joseph literally runs the opposite direction, she manages to grab his cloak and keeps a firm grip on it. And when Potiphar comes home, she tells him that Joseph, his slave, had attacked and tried to sleep with her, and she seemingly has the coat to prove it. And he believes her and immediately throws Joseph in prison. So there we go. His second coat of our story, gone. So we've got Potiphar's wife over here. We're just going to do this coat brown because remember, it's not the same coat with all the colors that his dad gave him because he already lost that one. But Potiphar's wife holds it and he gets thrown in prison. So this is going to be prison over here. But we'll just do that. Okay. So he's in prison. Now, this is not fair. Last time you were with your small groups, you talked about situations that you've been in that weren't fair. This is definitely a major one for Joseph. And trust me, Joseph doesn't get everything right. He would have been better off not bragging to his brothers about that dream that he had at the beginning of our story. But in this case, Joseph is innocent. Do you guys remember the book Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day? Or maybe you saw the movie? Well, Joseph's experiencing the extended version. It's Joseph and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad few years. He's sold into slavery by his brothers. He's taken to this foreign city, and he ends up working in the home of the captain of the guard. And just when things are looking up, He's thrown in prison for a crime he didn't commit. In some ways, that can be like 2020 has felt, can't it? What's one or two ways that things have felt like they keep going wrong this year for you? Maybe it was online school and that was just really hard. Maybe it's that sports or dance was canceled. Or it's not getting to celebrate your birthday the way that you usually do with a whole bunch of friends. Or maybe you've got two brutal classes every day for 18 hours a day at school. Or perhaps things have been tense at home with your siblings or your parents through COVID. That can feel discouraging and frustrating and just really hard some days, can't it? But don't miss this again. Halfway down page 32. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And so the warden put Joseph in charge of all of those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. Even in prison, the Lord was with Joseph. Even in prison, the prison warden noticed. And so, even in the midst of this absolutely crazy year, you guys, God is with you. I want you to write that somewhere on your page. God was with Joseph, and God is with me. Write that somewhere on your page. God's with me. And how you choose to live in the midst of this year and all the chaos and upside down, it has the potential to be inspiring and compelling to others who are watching. At your school, at your home, or even in your small group at youth. Now, as he was in prison, Joseph also picked up another talent. God gifted him with this really unusual ability to discern the meaning of dreams. Now, I kind of wish that I could do a Zoom call with Joseph and ask him what my crazy dreams are all about, because they honestly are ridiculous. You'll have to ask me about them sometime. But while he's in prison, he can interpret dreams, and so he interprets the dreams of these two fellow inmates. One was Pharaoh's baker, and his other was the chief cupbearer. What is a cupbearer? Take some guesses or look it up. And again, something I always wonder is how did the baker end up in prison? So you can see I've got my baker with his little baker hat and cupbearer with his little cup. But here's what happens. Long story short, Joseph interprets their dreams, and what he says comes true. The baker is killed, but the cupbearer is given back his position in the palace. But here's the thing. He completely forgets to put in a good word to the Pharaoh about Joseph. Now, there's a whole lot more to that story, and you can go read about it in Genesis chapter 40. That might be a cool thing to do this week. But essentially, Joseph remains stuck in prison for another 2 years, for a total of 10. It's an entire decade that he sits in prison serving time for a crime he didn't commit. Have you ever had one of those days or seasons where it feels like everything that could go wrong does, and then somehow something else that you couldn't possibly have expected goes wrong too? So it's like the day that you stayed up too late and you sleep in past your alarm and you miss your bus and then you get to school and then you realize that you put your shirt on wrong and then you get to class and you completely forget about a test and then you have a soccer game and you miss the shot that would have won the game, and it's just thing after thing after thing. For Joseph, having a chance that someone might put in a good word for him and then having them completely forget, that had to feel like that, but like 10 times worse. Are you kidding me? Of course this is happening. It's just that kind of day. It's just that kind of decade for Joseph. And yet, even in the darkness, even forgotten in prison in a foreign city, Joseph knows that God is with him. And so Joseph trusted God and waited. So in your picture, hopefully you've got Joseph and the cupbearer and the baker, and they're in prison. These are their dreams that he interpreted over there. And I want you to think about that question. Just like Joseph was trusting God, what are you trusting God for right now? What's something that you've been waiting for? Maybe a prayer you've been praying, but you haven't seen an answer yet. I want you to jot that down somewhere on your page too. And if you need to pause this and think about it for a few minutes, totally do it. Now, finally, 2 years after the baker and the cupbearer situation, Pharaoh himself has some troubling dreams. And at last, Joseph is called to come before him to interpret them. So, page 33. And remember, you guys can be like marking this up and highlighting it and marking it up everywhere. All right, 32. It says, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I can't do it, Joseph replied to the Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Okay, this is actually a really big deal. Because when the subject of dreams comes up, instead of using this like new skill to make himself look good and take the credit, Joseph focuses everyone's attention on God. Joseph's growing up. Remember at the beginning of our story when he was a little brat telling his brothers that they were going to bow down to him and then just fueling their jealousy and making them hate him? Now he's in front of the Pharaoh, like the king, doing something really impressive and giving all the credit to God. He's realizing, it's not actually about me, is it? This part of Joseph's story, it had me doing some self-reflection this week too. Where in my life do I make it all about me? Where can I have the blinders on and only see the ways that a situation impacts my life or my convenience or even my ego and not think about how maybe it affects the people in my family or my friends or the people I sit beside at school or on the bus? How about you? Where do you do that? Where do you make it all about you? And maybe you sometimes forget how a situation might impact somebody else. That's what Joseph's learning here in this part of our story. See, Joseph is realizing God is with me, as we've seen over and over, and it's not actually about me at all. It's all about him, about God. And so Joseph, he goes on to interpret the dreams for the Pharaoh, and he tells him that 7 years of bumper crops, which means like really, really good crops, are going to come across Egypt. But then after that, they'd be followed by 7 years of famine where things just wouldn't grow and there'd be a food shortage. And Pharaoh's response, we get to read it on page 33. It says, Then the Pharaoh said to Joseph, well, since God has made all of this known to you, and since there's no one so discerning and wise as you should be put in charge of my palace and of all of the people. They're going to submit to your orders. I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. And the Pharaoh, he took his ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's, and he dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Like, this is actually crazy what's happening. The Pharaoh, he quickly realizes that it's God who's at work through Joseph, and he puts him in charge of everything. Second in command in Egypt. We've seen over and over that God was with Joseph and that those around him were watching and noticing. And once more, Joseph has a new coat. I'm going to make it yellow. It's fine linen. I don't know. It'll look something like this. It'll match Pharaoh's king crown over here. There we go. See, how does a guy go from being a slave that was sold by his brothers to second in command in Egypt? When we started, Joseph was 17. That's like some of you guys. And now he's 30 years old, closer to my age. Think about how long the last 8 months have felt for you. Joseph went from being the favored son to a slave to a prisoner to being in charge of the entire land of Egypt over the course of 13 years, and he spent 10 of them in prison. But the whole time, you guys, God was writing his story, and God was with him. And God's about to unfold this huge piece of the upper story in and through Joseph, but we're going to have to wait, and you guys will learn about that next week in your small groups. But as I look at this whole picture of Joseph's life to this point, it's like a yo-yo. There's ups and downs where he is the favored son and then he gets sold, but then he and Potiphar get along and he's put in charge of a bunch of stuff, and then he's wrongly accused even though he does the right thing, and then finally after a lot of waiting, he gets put in charge of Egypt. It's crazy. But he lived with integrity no matter where he was, even in prison. See, the thing about Joseph was that he gave God credit for the dreams, and people noticed. People at school, they're watching you too. They're watching the way you act, the words that you use, how you talk about others, how you respond in different situations. When you head into each day, do you remember that God's with you? Or is it something that you just kind of think about when you're watching church on the weekend or when you're at youth? When you go throughout your day, are you looking for ways to make your life a little bit easier, or are you looking for every opportunity to encourage or help somebody else? See, the idea is that as we learn to follow Jesus, as we remember that God's with us, we'll take every chance we can to love others and to give God all the credit. And as you do, people will notice there's something different about him. There's something different about her. And as they get to know you more, they'll realize it's because your story, it isn't all about you. It's actually all about God. And that's a pretty amazing thing. And as I think about Joseph's story and my own story, I'm reminded that the same God that was with Joseph is with me every day too. And so, when do you need to remember that God's with you? Actually take a moment and write it down or circle where you did write it down. I need to remember that when I'm anxious. I need to remember that when I'm discouraged. And I need to remember that when I have the opportunity to love others. How awesome would it be if we remember that God's with us and that others are watching and noticing, and it actually started to impact those around us? What if you could actually encourage and support your friends at school? What if you helped things at home feel like just a little more calm and peaceful in this season? What if someone in your class actually started asking questions about God because they know that you trust him? So have a look at your picture or your notes or your chicken scratch, whatever it looks like. Here's mine. And in the same way that God was with Joseph, no matter what, he's with you this week too. Remember that. Live into that. Let me pray for you. God, thanks for Joseph's story. Thanks that you're with us just like you were with Joseph. And God, I pray that as we head into the rest of our week, that we would be reminded of that often, that you are with us and that others are watching. And would you help us find every opportunity to encourage others, to love others, and to make our stories all about you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Guys, thanks for watching, and we cannot wait to see you at youth in your small groups next week.